So I'm going to talk about the Old World Geography and the Book of Mormon. So a few months ago, I presented on the New World Geography, which is quite controversial. Uh,
Mhm.
this one is much less controversial. It seems like most scholars believe very similar things as in terms of the Old World Book of Mormon geography. Um, so before I start, I wanted to introduce you to George Potter. Has anyone ever heard of him or read any of his stuff?
No.
Okay. So George, he's a CPA by trade, but he lived in Arabia for 27 years. And during that time, he produced several films on Book of Mormon and biblical research. Um, he's had several articles published in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, and he's the author of 5 books. Um, and I've brought a few of them here with me, but um, I met him in August at Education Week at a class in BYU. I heard he was in the audience, so I tracked him down and asked him if I could, email him a couple questions on his research because there were some questions that I had, and he was very generous with his time, gave me his email address. We've been emailing pretty consistently for the last several months about various things. Um, he asked me to read a copy of his last book, this one in 2024, and kind of, read it before it's published and give him his thoughts and things like that, which I did. He read my book. I sent him a copy, and he gave me a really great review that I was able to use on my website. He's just a cool guy. Um, but ever since August, I kind of decided I wanted to dust off some of his books that I had read years ago and kind of refamiliarize myself with them. And so that's what's kind of been on my mind the last few months is kind of his research and his contributions. So I would say like 85, 90% of this presentation will be from his research on this area. There's other scholars that have contributed to this field a lot as well. Um, but I kind of want to look at it through his research specifically. So I'm going to divide this into 2 parts tonight. Part one will be Lehi's Exodus, and then part two we'll talk about the Jaredites. So what do we know about Lehi's Exodus? So the first leg of his journey, all we have is this scripture, First Nephi 1, verse 4 through 6. And it says that Lehi departed from Jerusalem and he went into the wilderness, and then he came down by the borders near the shore of the Red Sea. And then from there, he traveled 3 days into the wilderness, and then he pitched his tent by a valley by the side of a river. And of course, we know that Lehi named this valley Lemuel and the river Laman. So that's kind of the only information we have. But to recap, we know that they started at Jerusalem, they went into the wilderness, then they came to the borders near the Red Sea. From there, they had a 3-day journey to the valley of Lemuel and river Laman. So in Lehi's day, there were 4 routes from Jerusalem to the Red Sea. 2 of them are pretty easy to eliminate for various reasons I didn't want to spend too much time on, but it kind of leaves us with 2 main candidates. So this map kind of shows actually 3 of the main candidates. You have the Way of the Wilderness on the far right. That is east of the Dead Sea and Jordan. Then you have the King's Highway, which is near to it. And then on the west side of the Dead Sea, you have this other trail. Um, and I don't think there's enough information in the text of the Book of Mormon, or at least for me to have formed an opinion on which of these trails they took. Um, but it doesn't really matter because they all kind of converge at the same point or near the same point, and they all lead to the same part of the Gulf of Aqaba, which of course leads into the Red Sea. So this is where they probably took one of these 2, probably not the King's Highway in the middle, but probably one of the either the red or blue trail.
Rick,
Yeah.
how long would it have taken them with families and tents and everything else to get from Jerusalem down to to this spot?
Probably several days. The Book of Mormon doesn't say how long it took them. It just said they departed into the wilderness and then they went to the Red Sea. So we don't know how long they took, if they stopped along the way or if they just took a straight shot there. But yeah, it was several miles. Probably I don't want to guess. We should look it up and find out for sure. But
Well, you know
they
what, Rick? It seems to me that there was something that was said in a previous presentation that someone made, and maybe it was yours, and maybe I'm getting it mixed up with something else, but it seemed like it was a like a 4 week round trip. I like when they went back for the plates, it took them 2 weeks to get back up to Jerusalem and then 2 weeks to get back down where they were first camped.
well, the Book of Mormon doesn't say how long it took them. So
Okay,
anything outside of that is just kind of speculating. I
okay.
just Googled the distance. It's 538 kilometers. So I don't know how many miles that is, but probably close to 500 miles. So it probably took them a little bit of time, but yeah, the Book of Mormon just doesn't say. But once they got to the Red Sea, this is what the text of the Book of Mormon says. They arrived at the Red Sea, which is the Gulf of Aqaba. And the Book of Mormon says the Lehi journeyed for 3 days, both by the borders and also in the borders that were near the shore of the Red Sea. So, what does Nephi mean exactly when he says borders? So, George Potter believes that border meant mountains. He said, we learned from the Arabs that the name of the mountains in northwest Arabia, the Hijaz, meant the borders. Hugh Nibley agrees with this border mountain translation. And there's also some scripture evidence as well. For example, Moses commanded his people to go not up to Mount Sinai or to touch the border of it, kind of using those interchangeably. So if that's true, if that's what Nephi meant when he says we traveled by the border and in the border, then Lehi traveled along the Red Sea next to a mountain range or by the borders for part of this 3 day journey. And then he traveled through a mountain range or he traveled in the borders for the other part of this 3 day journey before he reached the valley of Lemuel and River Laman. So here's two images that George Potter took. The first one is what Lehi would say we traveled by the borders. Okay, so you can see the Red Sea, and on the other side is a mountain, and then there's a trail that goes right down the coast. And so Nephi and his party would have traveled by the borders near the Red Sea. Then you follow that trail for a while, and then you get to the second picture, and pretty soon you can't follow this trail anymore. You can see that big cliff over there. There's no trail, it's just a mountain. You can't pass along the Red Sea anymore. You would have to then go into the mountain in order to get around it. So that would be what Nephi probably would have described as in the borders. So this is Potter's experience as he was traveling this trail for the first time, trying to find where Lehi journeyed. It says 15 miles south of Hakal, we came to the shoreline mountains, which extended into the sea and blocked our passage. To our left was a wadi that led into the mountains. It was the only valley leading into the mountains that we had passed since leaving Hakal, or however you say that. If this were Lehi's trail, then he had no choice but to enter this wadi. We checked Nephi's next instruction, and he traveled in the wilderness, in the borders which are nearer the Red Sea. We know these were the mountains near the sea, and Nephi said they went in them. So Nephi said they traveled by the borders near the Red Sea, and then he said we traveled in the borders which were nearer the Red Sea. So these mountains are closer to the Red Sea than the other ones, and it just describes what Nephi is describing perfectly. So here's a map that you can kind of see. They're traveling along the coast, and all of a sudden they have to go into this wadi and kind of go around this mountain. So George Potter entered this valley, followed this pass for several miles, and it led them down to a valley near the Red Sea known as Wadi Taib al-Izm. And 1 second. He said, by using Nephi's text as a guide, One passes directly from Aqaba to the fertile Wadi Tayyib al-Izm, a 75-mile journey, where we found an oasis of hundreds of date palms, wild grain, a river of continuously flowing water, and a magnificent granite canyon. So all the things that Nephi is describing in his record is present in this valley. So these are two images that George Potter emailed to me back in August. And you can see this massive valley and then this river, which is probably more like a stream, but this river that runs through the canyon into the Red Sea, just like the Book of Mormon would have described the valley of Lemuel and the river Laman. So regarding this river, the Book of Mormon says the waters of the river Laman emptied into the fountain of the Red Sea. The fountain meaning the Gulf of Aqaba that leads into the Red Sea. And so this verse is how we know that they were not at the Red Sea, but at the Gulf of Aqaba, which was the fountain which led to the Red Sea. This river actually flows year round. It's like the only river in the entire area for miles, hundreds of miles. This area is such a desert and so barren. This is like one of the only oases in the area with any water at all. Brant Gardner said, of the three possible candidates for the Valley of Lemuel, only Wadi Tayyib al-Izm appears to meet the most difficult requirement, a continually running river. So Kent Brown, BYU professor, asked a good question. Said, is 75 miles too far for this group of 6 to travel in 3 days? Most likely not. They surely had loaded their baggage onto animals because the tents alone, if we can appeal to Bedouin tents as a proper model, weigh several hundred pounds, and loaded camels travel around 3 miles per hour. The average 25 miles per day, therefore, is not unreasonable, even when traveling into the hills and mountains. So it is on the further into their, 25 miles a day is probably pushing it, but it is certainly possible for a small family to do. Lehi built an altar at this location, and this is an image from a documentary that George Potter made of a man-made altar in this area. In another location, which is another altar location, they found pottery dating back to 600 BC at that site. Pretty interesting. So here's kind of what Lehi's journey so far might have looked like. They start at Jerusalem and then go to the Red Sea, then 3 days journey to Wadi Tayyib al-Izm. Okay, talk about the frankincense trail. After they left this valley, it says, the Lord commanded Lehi that on the morrow he should take his journey into the wilderness. So most LDS scholars agree that Lehi was most certainly following an ancient trade route known as the Frankincense Trail. You can see it on this map in red, what that ancient trail was. This was the only safe way to travel through Arabia. It is such a desert that you have to go this route or else you won't survive. It was not a road and not even a trail, but it was more a series of pit stops with wells and springs along the way. And so you would travel to the water and then camp there for a period of time, and then you'd make your 3, 4, or 5 day journey, whatever it was, to the next watering hole. And that's how you would travel. George Potter says the water holes were guarded and regulated public property of the ruling tribe, which necessitated Lehi's interaction with local people. More on that later. Lehi would have needed to trade his goods and supplies for access to this water. They didn't just give it away for free. It was their way of making money. So that means that once Lehi ran out of supplies, he would have had to have traded his family's labor for this water. He had several boys of working age that could have worked off any debts and things. So that might have explained why it took them 8 years to get to Bountiful, because they had to go slow, because they had to stop and work and provide service along the way in order to get access to their water and then be on their way. which
Hey,
makes a lot of
Rick,
sense. Yeah,
it also might explain why Arnold Freeberg's pictures of Nephi had huge guns.
that's right. Thanks, Dave.
You bet, buddy.
All right. So after they leave the valley, they journey for a time to a place called Shazer. It says we did journey for the space of 4 days in nearly a south-southeast direction. That verse is really helpful to tell us that yes, they were following this frankincense trail. I mean, that was the direction of the trail. It was literally a south to southeast direction. And so they pitched their tents in a place that they called Shazer or Shazer. So what do we know about Shazer? Shazer is an Arabic word meaning trees by water. And there was wild game near Shazer, according to Nephi. This picture right here is Wadi Agar. It's the best candidate for Shazer due to its abundance of trees, water, wild game. It's like an oasis in the middle of nowhere, and it's right where we would find 4 days journey from Wadi Taib al-Ism. So after this camp, they traveled for the space of many days again. We did pitch our tents for the space of a time that we might again rest ourselves, obtain food for our family. Hugh Nibley said, Lehi's party is described as moving through the desert for a few days, 3 or 4, one would estimate, and then camping for the space of a time. This is exactly the way the Arabs move. Okay, the camp of the broken bow. So Nephi breaks his bow at this next location. The Book of Mormon and Lehi's party, they don't name this location in the record, so scholars just simply call it the camp of the broken bow. But what do we know about this camp? Well, Nephi, he found wood and he made a bow and he made an arrow. Hugh Nibley said, according to the ancient Arab writers, the only bow wood obtainable in all of Arabia grew only amid the inaccessible and overhanging cliffs of Mount Jassam and Mount Oz, which are situated in the very region where, if we follow the Book of Mormon, the broken bow incident occurred. So here's a map of this area that Nibley's talking about. And you can see on this map, this green line. So George Potter explored this area and learned from the locals that the Adam, or it's an olive tree, it's the only wood in this entire area that can be used for a bow and arrow. There's nothing else in this entire desert that would work. And so this tells us that they were pretty close to this area. That was kind of in a mountainous area. So they probably camped below the mountain near Fish Ash on the map. And then they would go to the mountains to hunt for food there. So okay, after they leave the camp of the Broken Bow, the Book of Mormon says that they did take our journey traveling nearly the same course as the beginning, which is the south-southeast direction. And after we have traveled for the space of many days, we did pitch our tents again, that we might tarry for the space of a time. And it came to pass that Ishmael died and was buried in the place which was called Nahom. So remember that phrase, they buried him in the place which was called Nahom. Kent Brown says, Nephi writes in the passive, the place which was called Nahom, clearly indicating that local people had already named the place. So if we compare this to other stops along the way, Lehi's party was often naming other locations, such as the Valley of Lemuel, River Layman. The place we did call the name of the place Shazer in 1 Nephi 16, but not so with Nahom. And it just so happens that this area right here on this map is right where the tribal region of Nahim or Nahim in Yemen is located. And interestingly enough, in 1997, 3 limestone altars were discovered by a German archaeological team at an ancient temple in this location in Marib, Yemen. Here's one of them. And on each of these 3 altars, the tribal name of NHM, you can see those letters on the second picture. That translates to NHM is inscribed. And of course, there's no vowels in ancient Semitic languages, so NHM is how the ancients in this region would have spelled Nahom or Nehim or Nehim, etc. So this was a humongous discovery when it happened, and it's kind of the really first major evidence of the Book of Mormon um, of the accuracy that it was an actual historic record. Kent Brown said, the inscriptions on the three altars from the 7th and 6th century BC, all mentioning the Nahum tribe, prove beyond doubt the existence of this tribal name in that region of Yemen during the first half of the first millennial BC when Nephi's party was on the move. So it's right where the Book of Mormon says it would be. They didn't name it Nahum. It was already called Nahum. And here we find this altar. Then after this, we discovered ancient maps. This one's from 1700, showing the tribal region of Nahum in this area. And Joseph Smith did not have access to any of these maps in 1820. Pretty remarkable. This is a picture of Nahum right here. It's pretty barren. So returning to the text of the Book of Mormon, Ishmael died and was buried in the place which was called Nahum. It came to pass that the daughters of Ishmael did mourn exceedingly because of the loss of their father. So Nahum was actually an ancient burial site. That's what this land was used for. And the word Nahum means to mourn, to come to terms with the death. And here we have the text of the Book of Mormon saying, we buried him here and we are mourning exceedingly because of this death. So Ishmael died and was buried in the place which is called Nahum. I really like this quote. Mark Johnson said, I feel that it is most likely that Ishmael died well before the Lehites arrived at Nahum, possibly weeks or even months before. Hugh Nibley points out that it is not uncommon for desert people to carry their dead many miles to locate the proper place of burial. And just as the bones of Joseph were brought up out of Egypt and buried in Shechem, it only seems natural that the Lehites would wait until they found a proper place to bury Ishmael. The place of Nahum is a few miles off the main incense trail that Lehi took. It is unlikely that they would go out of their way unless it was rather important. Surely a death of a loved one would qualify. Nahum already existed and was already a place of burial. The chances seem slim that Ishmael would die as the party arrived at Nahum. The logical conclusion is that Ishmael died along the way and was carried to Nahum. All right. In 2008, there were 400 stone grave markers discovered from Wadi Joff, which is a burial site near Nahum. And these grave markers date back to 400 BC to 700 BC. Several of these grave markers had carvings of the face of the deceased on the stone, and then the name of the deceased underneath the face. So here you can see in the image what one of these stones looked like. And among the grave markers discovered, this one that you're looking at had the name YSML inscribed on it. And it dated back to between 600 BC and 500 BC. So the author of this article that I got these sources from, Neil Rapaloi, says the name YSML or Yishmael is equivalent to the Hebrew name Ishmael. So, and then he goes on to say that some scholars believe that this style of grave marker was made by foreigners or caravanners. In other words, people who were connected in some way to the locals, but not members of the community. And he says the very fact that an Ishmael was buried in close proximity to the Nahum tribal region around the very time the Book of Mormon indicates that a man named Ishmael was buried at Nahum is rather remarkable. So obviously we don't know if this was Ishmael's grave marker or not, but very interesting that we found a grave marker that says Ishmael on it in this location. Okay. So after Nahum, the Book of Mormon says that they turned eastward. It says, from this time forth, we did travel nearly eastward from that time forth during their journey. So you can see by this map that they were headed towards the Dhofar region in southern Oman. I want you to remember that name, Dhofar. And this, where they're headed, was the beginning or the ending point of the frankincense trail, depending on which way you're traveling. Okay, so I want to pause right here. And I promised a few slides about Christmas since it's Christmas time. I want to talk about the wise men in the Christmas story, in the Nativity. and discuss how they could potentially fit in our story here, what we're talking about. George Potter wrote an article 20 years ago almost called "Does the Book of Mormon Solve a Christmas Mystery?" I read this back in 2006. I thought it was so cool, and I'm kind of shocked that it hasn't picked up any traction as far as I know. Like, I haven't heard anyone else talk about this article since I read it. So the rest of these slides in this section are points made from this article that he wrote. So regarding the wise men, where did the wise men learn about the star that appeared at Christ's birth? Um, Notice that the New Testament doesn't mention an angelic visitation, like the shepherds got an angel. The wise men didn't. So that leads us to believe that it was likely from oral and written traditions of their forefathers. So first, let's determine who their forefathers were, and then we can determine how they might have received this knowledge. So, question, did the wise men come from Arabia? The New Testament says the wise men came from the east, but to those in Jerusalem, the east usually meant Arabia. For example, if you look up Arabia under the LDS Bible Dictionary, the Arabs were often called children of the east. So that was kind of the east to them. What else do we know about the wise men? Well, they followed a star, which tells us they were familiar with stellar navigation. The Arabs were among the first to use stellar navigation, a knowledge that they had mastered from centuries of crossing the Arabian desert. What else do we know about them? Well, they brought frankincense with them, and frankincense comes from the sap of the boswellia trees found mainly in the Dhofar region, right where Lehi was headed, of southern Oman, or Lehi's Bountiful. And in fact, that's how it got the name the Frankincense Trail. This is where the frankincense came from. From Dhofar, the frankincense was then transported via the Frankincense Trail and traded with surrounding countries. What else do we know about the wise men? Well, they brought myrrh with them, and myrrh is a resin that comes from the myrrh tree, which is native to the Dhofar region of Oman again. So from Dhofar, the myrrh was then transported via the Frankincense Trail and traded with surrounding countries. We also know they brought gold with them. So many of the countries with access to gold, such as India, traded with the Arabs for their frankincense and myrrh, which made gold very abundant in southern Arabia. So the wise men had access to gold, frankincense, and myrrh, which were all very prominent in Arabia at that time. What else do we know about the wise men? According to the LDS Bible Dictionary, under Magi, the wise men were, quote, likely representatives of a branch of the Lord's people somewhere from the east, which suggests that the wise men were either Jews or at the very least Hebrews. They were probably a branch of the Lord's people. I mean, they believed in the Lord, so it makes sense that they were either Jews or Hebrews at the very least. Most Arabs were Hebrews, and there were even many Jewish communities in Arabia, so there were Jews there. So based on all this, Potter concludes, and I agree, that Arabia is perhaps the best candidate for where the wise men journeyed from.
So Rick,
Yeah.
did
Mhm.
these people were they taken part of the 10 tribes when the Syrians took over the northern kingdom?
No, but there were, I mean, just like Lehi fled due to corruption in Jerusalem and, settled um, in exile, there was a lot of groups that did the same thing throughout history, and a lot of them settled in Arabia. So there may have been groups that were scattered when Assyrians came, but I don't think that we know that for sure. But there were definitely lots of Jewish communities who fled Jerusalem in order to live their more pure religion, which they felt was being corrupted in Jerusalem. So there were lots of little pockets of Jewish communities along this trail.
Okay.
Okay, so how did the wise men learn of the star? Well, remember, there's no mention of an angel appearing to the wise men, unlike the shepherds. Instead, they probably had this oral or written tradition for quite some time because when they finally saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. It's finally here. So George Potter said, prior to the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, Christendom had no explanation of how Arab wise men could have obtained this knowledge. However, the Book of Mormon provides a simple explanation of how this knowledge could have reached southern Arabia, or at least the Jewish communities in the Arabian Peninsula. So during their 8 years sojourn through Arabia, Lehi encountered people at each watering hole along the way, and being a prophet would have most certainly taught them the gospel, at least to anyone who would listen. And Lehi and Nephi, who were fresh off their visions at the Valley of Lemuel, had plenty of new information to offer the Arabs that was not already written in their Old Testament. So, for example, Nephi says, I looked and beheld the virgin again bearing a child in her arms. And they even said, 600 years from the time that my father left Jerusalem, a prophet would the Lord God raise up among the Jews, even a Messiah, or in other words, a Savior of the world. So Lehi and Nephi knew the exact year that Christ would be born to a virgin at Jerusalem. And notice that Lehi and Nephi were not told in their vision that Christ would be born in Bethlehem. Instead, they were told that Christ would be born, quote, among the Jews. And this is interesting because this seems to be all the information that the wise men had as well, because they didn't know where to find Jesus other than at Jerusalem. They go to Jerusalem and ask Herod, where's Christ? So it seems like they knew it would be at Jerusalem, but not exactly where, which is kind of the information that Nephi and Lehi have in the Book of Mormon. The Nephites knew about the new star, at least in the New World. Samuel the Lamanite talked about it. So if the Lord gave Lehi or Nephi this knowledge of this new star, then they could have been able to teach the Arabs everything that they would have needed to know to find Christ when he was born. So we don't know, obviously, but it's something to consider, and it's to this date the best, in my opinion, the best explanation of where these wise men came from, how they learned about Christ, how they knew about a star, how they knew when to look for it, and things of that nature. And they also had access to the gold, frankincense, and myrrh that they could. So we don't know, but kind of interesting. So there's my Christmas slides for you. Okay, Lehi turns eastward. Let's return to our narrative. So they were headed to Dhofar in Oman, which is the beginning or ending part of the Frankincense Trail. But to get there, they had to cross Arabia's empty quarter. So this stretch right here, this eastward journey, was by far the most dangerous part. And it was dangerous for three reasons: the lack of water, isolation, there wasn't nearly as many people there, and lawlessness. Because there was no tribes, there was a lot less laws, and people could kind of do what they please. It was kind of the wild, wild west. And here's a scripture from this leg of their journey. Nephi says, and so great were the blessings of the Lord upon us, we did live upon raw meat in the wilderness. For the Lord had not hitherto suffered that we should make much fire as we journeyed in the wilderness. For he said, I will make thy food become sweet, that you cook it not. He nimbly said that Lehi's party were trespassers wherever they walked. Every inch of the desert is claimed by some tribe or other that will demand the life of a trespasser. They never dared build fire on the open plain where it would attract the attention of a prowling raiding party over long distances and invite a night attack. So this stretch of their journey, when they didn't have fire, very on purpose, they could have attracted a lot of attention by a fire, which wouldn't have ended well. And yet the Lord blessed them that they didn't need that fire. They were able to survive upon raw meat, which is a miracle. Okay, so they're headed to Dhofar, and you can see on this satellite image that this Dhofar area is the only green place in this entire desert. Like there's this little oasis over there on the coast, in an otherwise just nothing. So this area is by far the best candidate for Lehi's Bountiful. So while Dhofar is the best candidate, there is still some debate as to where exactly in Dhofar that Lehi's Bountiful was. Most scholars fall into one of two camps, either Khor Rori or Khor Karfut. You can see from this image, Khor Rori's a little bit further north, and then Cor Carfoot's below it. Both are good candidates. Both have their pros and cons. I'm currently undecided. I don't know. Um, I don't have an opinion on it yet. But with that said, here's a few images from each location. So just know that going in that some of these are kind of at both locations. But so what do we know about Bountiful? We know it's along the seashore. We know that it has a wide variety of fruits. And yeah, these are all images of this area. It has wild honey. There's wild bees in this area, which we're going to come back to in a minute. There's a prominent mountain nearby. Remember, Nephi went to the mountain to pray and to get revelations from the Lord. There's ore available in these mountains, and there's stones to make fire. There were beasts or skins available for Nephi to make bellows, and there was meat from the wilderness available. They needed really strong trees that would be able to be good shipbuilding material. And these trees in the area are really good for that. There were cliffs directly above the sea. Remember, Laman and Lemuel wanted to throw Nephi off of them and kill him. So there has to be cliffs nearby. There's in one of the locations, there's a harbor. This is Khor Rori, a perfect harbor to build and launch a ship. This is probably the strongest argument for Khor Rori. Most of these other pictures from the other location, but this image, like they had to have a place to build a ship, and this is just a perfect candidate for that. And from there, they could have sailed to the New World. So that's part one of Nephi's journey and what it looked like. Any questions on the Nephites before we move on to the Jaredites? Okay. So the Jaredites, there's a lot less information to trace the Jaredites' path. The Book of Mormon has a lot of details that for the Nephites that the Jaredites just don't give. So is it possible to retrace the Jaredites' path in the New World? So unless otherwise noted, the remaining slides are going to be taken from George Potter's book called Discovering the Amazing Jaredites. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is decide where the Tower of Babel is located. And according to Genesis, after the great flood, the descendants of Noah journeyed from the east and they found a plain in the land of Shinar. So Shinar means the country of two rivers. And it's believed that that area is referring to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And Shinar was also referred to as Sumer, which is the world's first known civilization, which started around 3500 BC. And so the Tower of Babel was likely located here in Sumer, in ancient Babylonian, near modern day Baghdad. So here's a map. You can see Sumer on the first one in red. And on the second one, you can see the two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates. So this is most likely where the Tower of Babel was based on all the information we have. It's a really great candidate. Okay, so after the Tower of Babel, after the languages are confounded, the Book of Mormon says that the Lord commanded them they should go forth into the wilderness, yea, even into that quarter where there never had been man. That's a really interesting phrase. Is this referring to the Arabia's empty quarter, the one that Lehi journeyed through, the quarter where never had man been? So this was the question that George Potter asked himself after he had published his work on Lehi's trail. He said, I knew that there had been a trail leading from ancient Babel into the heart of the empty quarter. I had even explored most of the trail and realized that if you continued following the course of that trail, it would lead you straight to the ancient port of Khor Rori, the harbor where Nephi built his ship. He says, on entering Bountiful, Nephi recorded that the land had been, quote, prepared of the Lord. Could it have been prepared by the Jaredites who prepared Bountiful? So that's the question. So according to George Potter, there are two possible scenarios for how the Jaredites reached the empty quarter in southern Arabia. Because the Lord commanded the Jaredites to build after the manner of barges, which he had hitherto built. This is before they left to the New World. They were building barges before that. Is it possible that the Jaredites first built barges and sailed them in the calm waters of the Persian Gulf? From there, the Jaredites would have crossed the Great Sand Desert to the Dhofar region. So on this map, I've kind of mapped out what that might have looked like if they sailed those waters. Or another possibility, another possible route is that the Jaredites traveled the entire distance over land to Oman, and that the Lord was instructing the Jaredites, who were professional shipbuilders, to construct ships the way they had been built barges in Sumer. So we don't know where they were building their original ships from. If it was Sumer, then they may have traveled through land. If the Lord had them build them to cross the Persian Gulf, then that's where they got their shipbuilding experience. But either way, once they hit this empty quarter, this was a very dangerous stretch of their journey. And so the Lord made sure that the Jaredites were well stocked with provisions prior to their journey. You can read those verses and see all the things that they were able to bring with them. And then the Lord did go before them in a cloud and gave directions where they should travel. So this would have been the only way to guarantee survival in this desert. You had to have a ton of supplies, and I think the Lord had to go before you and give you directions. It was that necessary to survival to find any traces of water or anything that might have been there in that time. There's also a possibility that the empty quarter was a little bit more wet than it is now. Potter's done some research and said, you know, if it was so difficult to traverse, how could the Jaredites have possibly survived it? Indeed, they made their journey and did it without the aid of camels, which were domesticated much later. The answer is found in the empty quarter's changing weather patterns. In antiquity, there were stronger monsoons that could reach over the Mahar Mountains into the empty quarter. The rains formed lakes and rivers that have since dried up. So it may have been a little bit better conditions than it is now. But either way, very, very dangerous, and you needed the Lord to go before you. So they would also, the Jaredites would also need a harbor to build their barges. So Potter says the Jaredites appear to have been experienced shipbuilders. They would have realized that they needed a calm harbor where they could build and launch their ships. They also needed many of the same tangible resources that Nephi needed to fabricate his ship: strong, straight hardwoods, cotton or other fabric for sails, cordage for rope, and so on. The inlet of Korori would have provided an excellent calm water and a naturally protected harbor. So again, if it was helpful for the Nephites to build a ship there, it would have been helpful for the Jaredites as well. The brother Jared met the Lord on a mountain that he described as being of exceeding height, probably the same mountain where the Lord appeared to Nephi. Okay, so the brother Jared got the 16 stones, but what he said about them was that they were white and clear, even as transparent as glass. And Arabia is famous for its clear quartz. This is an image of a clear quartz that was found in southern Oman. Honeybees. Okay, so the Book of Mormon records that the Jaredites took honeybees with them from Nimrod or Sumer to the seashore where they built their ships. He said it is likely that the Jaredite honeybee was the warm climate dwarf bee, Apis florea. These small wild bees lived in the warm climates of Southeast Asia. So what's interesting is that, okay, they bring these bees over to this area, and then Nephi, when he comes, he finds wild honey there in Bountiful. Potter says, Nephi realized or was taught that the Lord had prepared Bountiful with wild, not domesticated honey. To this day, honey in Oman is still gathered mostly as wild honey, and the bees are still considered wild. Okay, the Jaredites were a large people. We know that from the Book of Mormon. According to Potter, Ophir or the Korori area had a very large people living there for at least a short period of time, around 2500 BC. According to local tradition, living in the coastal plain of Ophir were giant men. We know the Jaredites knew how to make metal plates, and there have been several metal plates and a bronze plaque found at a temple in this Korori site. And in the early 1950s, yeah, there's this bronze plaque discovered in this area. Okay, steel swords. So the Jaredites knew how to molten out of the hill and make swords out of steel. So he says artifacts made of smelted iron have been uncovered in Mesopotamia, or where the Jaredites' Tower of Babel would have been, dating to circa 3000 BC. Since the Jaredites knew how to forge steel swords, they must have already known the technology when they left Sumer or Mesopotamia. The question begs to be asked, how did Nephi learn how to make quality swords like Laban's? One swordsmith told me that Nephi would have had to work side by side with the master sword maker for months in order to forge even a simple sword. Steel refining and sword making were active at Korori in the first millennium BC. This knowledge presents a logical explanation of how Nephi became highly competent as a master swordsmith. Jaredites appear to have brought sword-making technology from Sumer to Korori. Here then, while building a ship, Nephi had the opportunity to mentor under the tutelage of a master swordsmith. So lots of like circumstantial evidence, I guess, that the Jaredites were there in this area. And okay, but here's the kicker for me. Was the brother of Jared mentioned in the Old Testament? This is really cool. So if you read Genesis 10, you'll read about a man named Ophir. He was the great grandson of Noah. And Ophir was the brother of Jerah. And if you read that, it kind of sounds like the brother of Jared. According to Potter, he says, according to Smith and Sodhal's commentary on the Book of Ether, some early Bible translations spelled Jerah as Jared. Undoubtedly, Jared in the Bible account must have been none other than the family leader named Jared in the Book of Mormon. So there's a real possibility that the brother of Jerah is the brother of Jared in Genesis 10. And Ophir was his brother, or Mahanrai, Moriankimer. So according to the Bible in Genesis 10, Jerah fled Mesopotamia with Ophir and his other brothers at the time of the confounding of languages. According to the LDS Bible Dictionary, the inhabitants of southern Arabia are called in the Old Testament Joktanites, and Joktan was Ophir and Jerah's father. So Bible Dictionary says that the people in southern Arabia were Joktan's descendants, and of course, Ophir and his brother Jerah were among them. In Genesis 10:30, it says that their dwelling, this is after Ophir and his brother Jerah, after they fled Mesopotamia from the Tower of Babel, it says that they was from Misha as thou goeth unto Sephar, a mount of the east. So Potter says, he kind of explains this first. It says Jerah, or Jared, Ophir, and other brothers moved to Misha at Sephar, with a mountain on the east. Many scholars believe Sephar is Zophar or Dophar in Oman, whose harbor was called Mosha or Misha by the Greeks. In other words, there's a lot of evidence that where this family traveled to was this Dophar region. So interestingly, the brother of Jerah, which is Ophir, from Genesis 10, and the brother of Jared from the Book of Ether, each have a harbor named after them. So Ophir's harbor is mentioned in 1 Kings, and Solomon made a navy of ships, and they came to Ophir. And Ophir's harbor is believed to be located in Dophar, and the LDS Bible Dictionary states that Ophir was probably a port in southern Arabia. And the brother of Jared's harbor mentioned in Ether 2:13, it says, the Lord did bring Jared and his brethren forth even to that great sea which divideth the lands. And they came to the sea that they pitched their tents, and they called the name of the place Moriankimer. So this place by the sea is called Moriankimer, and the Bible has a harbor named Ophir. And the theory is these are the same two people. These are the only two accounts in Scripture where a harbor is named after a person. So was the brother of Jared mentioned in the Old Testament? So of course, Joseph Smith later revealed that the brother of Jared's name was Mahanrai Moriankimer. And George Potter gives this hypothesis, which I like. It says, when Jacob saw the Lord, he was given the new name Israel. The logical explanation then is that the man Ophir went up the mountain with 16 stones, passed through the veil into the presence of the Lord, and was given a new sacred name that would not be used in public. In the latter days, we have learned that his new name was Moriankimer. However, in the Jaredite record, he is only referred to as the brother of Jared because his new name was sacred. So his old name was Ophir. He sees the Lord on the mount, gets a new name. It's not revealed. It's sacred, and that's one of the reasons why we don't recognize Ophir in the Old Testament as being the brother of Jared. So kind of interesting. Okay, so this picture right here is George Potter with a man. Let me just read this. He says, local Amani historian Ali Ahmed Ali Ashashari grew up in the valley above Korori. BYU invited Mr. Shahari to make presentations at the university to discuss the rock art and inscriptions found in caves in the Dhofar region. He's the author of 11 books, mostly about the original language of southern Oman and the traditions of the area's native tribes. I must have a typo there. Shahari claims that the harbor of Korori and the west side of the valley above the harbor is the biblical land of Ophir. When I asked him how he knew with such certainty that Korori is Ophir, Ali opened his book, The Language of Ad, and proudly showed me his family genealogy. He can trace his family tree directly back to his ancestor named Jared, the son of Joktan, and Jared's younger brother Ophir. So this guy in this area who still lives there traces his genealogy back to Ophir, which might be the brother of Jared. The Book of Mormon does not indicate that all the Jaredites and their friends sailed away in their 8 barges. Since today's inhabitants of the area around Ophir believe they are descendants of Jared and Ophir, most of the Jaredites who originally left Babel must not have favored the idea of a dangerous sea voyage to an unknown destination and stayed behind in beautiful Ophir to become Ali Shahari's ancestors. So to conclude, Potter says growing evidence indicates that the Jaredites and the Nephites built their ships at the same harbor in southern Arabia, and that the Jaredites turned Ophir into Bountiful. So that's my presentation. I don't know if you guys have questions or not, or comments. I know I went fast, especially through that last part, but there you go.
That was fascinating.
I
Oh,
thought
good.
really, really good, Rick. Really good.
Good, thank you.
A lot to think about.
You know,
Makes you want to read the Old Testament really carefully and start analyzing all the names.
Yeah, very
Yeah, I'm not doing that.
interesting.
I thought
Well,
it was really
Steve's done
fascinating,
that for
Rick.
some of it.
Yes. Yeah, I wish Steve was here for this, for sure.
my
I-
sense is that whether one could argue it proves the Book of Mormon is true or not is irrelevant. It certainly creates a body of evidence that means the naysayers can't just go poo-poo on the whole story and discount it out of hand.
Sure. And
There
that's
is.
not
There's-
like critical, but to me, I appreciate that. I love that there's a little bit of evidence to support the Book of Mormon. It's really
Yeah.
hard to refute.
Hmm.
In those books, Rick, did they just end there? Did they talk about where they possibly could have sailed?
Oh, they keep going. So yeah, I can probably show you where I think that they sailed if you guys are interested. I know. What do you think, Dave? I know you probably have a different opinion.
Well, I've always been, they kind of talk about sailing over the Pacific. I just think it would be treacherous waters. I think sailing along the coast of Africa and coming up and having a shorter distance to America would make sense on a sailing scale. Going out into open waters from the Pacific would have been a difficult journey. That's my thought on it.
Yeah. Can you guys still see my screen?
No.
No. Okay, let me share it one more time. Okay. So I wrote this a while ago about after they left Bountiful, where did they go? I said the Book of Mormon gives us virtually no information that helps us answer this question. All we can do is make our best educated guess. While there are many possible routes Lehi's party could have taken, there's one route that seems more logical than others, which is that Lehi and his family followed the coastline for as long as possible before making the long voyage across the Pacific Ocean. Why? According to Joseph Allen, they stopped for provisions along the way. LDS historian Kelly DeVry states, Nephi no doubt kept close to the shore when he could. This was not something that was just tradition among shippers. This was used for safety and also used for resupply purposes. John Sorensen agrees. Said, did they stop on their way? Surely. Why go without water when you can go ashore and get it? And he also said, since boats routinely had to be beached for repairs after storms or have their bottoms scraped or to wait favorable winds, it is reasonable to assume that Lehi's party would have stopped from time to time on their journey along the coastline and through the Pacific Islands. So this is how the route that I think they took. So they leave Bountiful and then they stay along the coastline for as long as possible, resupplying, going to shore when possible. And then once they get to about here, it's really the long stretch of their journey. And so, where they landed, that's, obviously you guys know, I think they landed in Mesoamerica. But we know that the Book of Mormon is pretty clear that it was uh, West Coast landing. Alma 22 essentially says as much, that they landed on the West Coast. And so based on that scripture and based on those quotes above and things, this is what I think where they probably journeyed. So there you go. But Dave believes they traveled around Africa and went through the Atlantic and landed over by Florida somewhere, probably, Dave.
Yeah, you follow the trade winds of the hurricanes. I mean, all you have to do is see modern day hurricanes. They're starting, right around what would that be, Nigeria area, and right where Africa kind of bends over, and it just crosses the short distance of the Atlantic. I know when we say the short distance of the Atlantic, it's still a giant ocean. But if you follow the trade winds of a hurricane, that's where it starts, and then it goes over and usually ends up right around Florida area. The description of a storm, a 3-day storm, could have easily been a hurricane going along that same trade route.
Mm-hmm.
So.
But isn't it interesting then? Is it Hagoth that took off with all the ships, different trips that the Nephites left? And which way did he go? He was going west.
He said, well,
He went north.
I think he went north.
Well, I mean, he went north, but he left from the west side, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
That may have been getting him up into the trade winds going through the Hawaiian Islands and back to the west. One of the things that's kind of interesting about your directions here, Rick, is that you've got 3 lines in the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like there's nothing but water out there.
Right.
But interestingly enough, that's French. A lot of it is French Polynesia, and they have like 120 atolls that are just spread across that whole region. So it could very easily have been that they pulled up to some of those atolls to rest, to get fresh water, to do whatever they needed to do, and continued on to the east.
Yeah. Thank you.
Possibly, but once you get past those, there's atolls between, Hawaii up north and French Polynesia down south, there's nothing.
There's Gambia, there are the Marquesas Islands. Yeah, it is a fairly long distance, but there's a lot more land there than you would expect.
They needed a Leahona, right, Dave?
They needed a Leahona.
Or as we would call it, what did you call it? A star? What did you call it, Rick?
The stellar navigation.
Sextus.
Oh,
Sexton?
The astrolabe.
Astrolabe.
Yeah, there you go. That's from an old presentation. So anyway, a lot to think about. Any other thoughts, or you guys want to close this.
I think it's a lot to chew on. You've given us a lot to think about.
Good. If you guys want a good resource, there's a book, or not a book, called The Journey of Faith. It's on YouTube. It's right here. This Book of Mormon documentary. It interviews a lot of BOU scholars and other people that kind of talk about the same route that I took, and it'll kind of show you videos of some of this stuff. So that might be a good one to watch if you're. It's actually two parts. The second part is the New World, but that's part one, the journey through Arabia and things, and it's really good. So if you want more information or want to keep studying, that would be a good next step. Or you can get these books right here by George Potter, Lehi in the Wilderness and Discovering the Amazing Jaredites. This is kind of where I got most of that stuff. So
That's
Yeah.
really interesting. I'd never realized that there was someone that had written that much about it. And what's interesting to me too is that, you know, having been through the Mediterranean and seeing how recent they're finding a lot of the different cities and beginning to excavate those. They're just really beginning to get into some of the true excavation that needs to go on, and there may be some full cities or other things that will be found in the areas that you're talking about that are just covered right now. And once they're found, they can do the excavation work and archaeology work and see how they lived. And
those archaeologists are busy over there, aren't they?
yes, they
I
are.
looked up on Google Maps Dhofar, and it is fascinating. I mean, there's nothing all along Oman and Yemen, and then there's just this teeny little spot that is just mountains and trees and things. You know what?
Why would they not go up over by Greece and go that way? What kept them going east instead?
I don't know. I mean, obviously they were trying to get away from Zedekiah's reach. You know, if the people in Jerusalem wanted him killed, they had to go into hiding right away. So that would be my guess. They couldn't go, they didn't want to go to like
They
to
still
get to
were
Greece,
around
you'd have to either go
people.
through the Mediterranean or all through Lebanon and Syria, and that I'm sure that's where the Assyrians were and the Babylonians were.
So too many
Yeah.
enemies that way.
Yeah.
Well,
dangerous
and the
territory.
Egyptians.
Yeah, lots of enemies surrounding Israel, even today.
Yeah.
Yeah.